January 1979. Brooklyn, New York. The concrete was still wet when they poured it. Beneath a construction site on the western edge of Flatbush, workers would later find anomalies in the foundation. Irregular weight distribution, settled unevenly. Nobody asked questions. In Brooklyn in 1979, you didn't ask questions about foundations. His name was Robert Calandra, a small-time garment district vendor. 41 years old, father of 2. He had been warned 3 times. He owed the Gambino family $10 in weekly street tax, a tribute so small it barely registered as an insult. Except it did, because in organized crime it was never about the money. It was always about the principle. Robert Calandra was not a criminal. That was the problem. He ran a modest fabric stall in Brooklyn's garment district, the kind of operation held together by early mornings, calloused hands, and razor-thin margins. He paid his taxes. He kept his head down. He raised his children in a row house on East 21st Street, with a wife who ironed his shirts every Sunday. He was, by every measure, an ordinary man. But ordinary men in Brooklyn in the late 1970s did not exist in a vacuum. They existed inside a system, invisible to outsiders, suffocating to those within it, a system built not on law but on territory. The Gambino family owned that territory, not metaphorically, literally. Every block, every stall, every vendor cart operating within their jurisdiction paid tribute, weekly, without negotiation. The amounts were deliberately modest, $5 here, $10 there. The figure was never the point. Compliance was the point. Submission was the architecture upon which the entire empire rested. Calandra understood this. Every merchant on his street understood this. But Calandra had grown tired. His margins were collapsing. The city's economy was fracturing. New York in 1979 was a wounded place. Bankruptcy, blackouts, rising crime. He was already bleeding from every direction. $10 felt like 10,000. So he said no. Not loudly, not defiantly, quietly, almost apologetically. It didn't matter. To understand what happened next, you must understand who received that refusal. The Gambino family in 1979 was not in decline. It was ascending. Following the death of Carlo Gambino in 1976, the family had passed to Paul Castellano, a man who preferred boardrooms to back alleys, who wore tailored suits and conducted business from a Staten Island mansion he called the White House. Castellano was corporate in his ambitions, refined in his presentation. But refinement requires enforcement. Beneath Castellano operated a network of capos, neighborhood bosses, who managed street-level collections with mechanical precision. In Flatbush and the surrounding Brooklyn territories, that responsibility fell to men who had spent decades perfecting a singular skill, making examples. Because an empire built on voluntary compliance is not an empire. It is a suggestion. The collection system was elegant in its brutality. Street tax was not collected by the bosses themselves that would be beneath them. It moved through layers. A soldier would approach. Then a capo would be notified. Then a decision would travel upward, quietly, through channels invisible to the outside world. When Calandra refused the first time, a soldier returned. When he refused the second time, a capo was informed. When he refused the third time, the decision left the street entirely. It entered a different room, a quieter room. The kind of room where outcomes were not discussed, only confirmed. The third refusal happened on a Tuesday morning. Calandra had arrived early to open his stall. The street was still gray, vendors arranging their displays, steam rising from the grates below the pavement. A man approached, unhurried, unremarkable. He collected from 6 other vendors on that block alone. None of them looked up when he passed. Calandra looked him directly in the eye and said nothing. No money changed hands. That silence traveled faster than any argument could have. By afternoon, word had reached the capo responsible for that corridor. By evening, it had moved higher. Not because $10 mattered, but because silence in that world was the loudest possible statement a man could make. It said, "I do not recognize your authority." In organized crime, that sentence carries a singular consequence. What made Calandra's case different from routine collection disputes was timing. The Gambino family was in a period of internal consolidation. Castellano was restructuring hierarchy, reasserting discipline across all Brooklyn operations. Dissent, even minor, even civilian, could not be absorbed quietly. It had to be answered visibly, not for Calandra's benefit, for everyone watching. Every vendor on every block in every Gambino-controlled corridor in Brooklyn was, in that moment, paying attention. They always paid attention. Their survival depended on reading outcomes correctly. Calandra had just become an outcome. What protected the Gambinos was not violence alone. Violence was the last resort. The first resort was infrastructure. By 1979, the Gambino family had cultivated relationships extending far beyond Brooklyn's street corners, into city contracting offices, into union leadership, into the lower chambers of municipal politics where decisions about construction permits, zoning variances, and law enforcement priorities were quietly negotiated over dinner. This was Castellano's true innovation. He had repositioned the family not as a criminal organization, but as an invisible layer of government, parallel, unelected, permanent. The construction industry was central to this architecture. Gambino-connected figures held significant influence over concrete and masonry unions operating across all 5 boroughs. City contracts flowed through companies with clean exteriors and complicated interiors. Inspectors who asked too many questions found their careers suddenly complicated. Politicians who proved useful found their campaigns quietly supplemented. It was a system of mutually assured benefit, which meant that when a decision was made regarding Calandra, the mechanisms available to execute and conceal that decision were not improvised. They were institutional, already in place, already tested. The construction site on the western edge of Flatbush was not chosen randomly. It was a Gambino-connected project. The foreman answered to the right people. The concrete pour was already scheduled. Only the contents changed. Law enforcement in 1979 Brooklyn was not blind to Gambino operations, but blindness in that era was often a condition of employment. In the days before his disappearance, Calandra told 2 people, his wife and his neighbor, a man named Vincent, who ran a shoe repair shop 3 doors down from the fabric stall. He told them he was being pressured. He did not use names. He did not need to. In Brooklyn in 1979, names were unnecessary. Context was sufficient. His wife begged him to pay. $10, she said. Just $10. He refused. Not out of stupidity. Not out of pride exactly. Out of something older and harder to name. A conviction that a man who surrenders once surrenders permanently. That the first compliance was never the last compliance. He was correct about that. He was wrong about his ability to resist it. Vincent, the shoe repairman, said nothing when Calandra confided in him. He nodded. He expressed sympathy. He poured 2 glasses of wine. 3 days later, Vincent mentioned the conversation to someone he shouldn't have. Not maliciously. Out of fear. Because Vincent had his own arrangements with the same system Calandra was refusing. And in that world, information about resistance was itself a form of currency, one you spent quickly before it spent you. Calandra never knew. He continued opening his stall each morning, continued arranging his fabric displays, continued existing inside a window of time that was closing around him silently, from every direction simultaneously. He had no allies left. He simply didn't know it yet. They came on a Thursday. No ceremony, no confrontation, no final warning. 2 men approached Calandra as he was locking his stall at dusk. The street was thinning, vendors retreating homeward, the particular exhausted quietness of a Brooklyn evening settling over everything like sediment. One man spoke, calmly. He said Calandra was needed briefly, that someone wanted to speak with him directly, that it would take 20 minutes. Calandra hesitated, then went. Because the alternative, refusing, running, creating a scene on a public street, carried its own consequences, and because some part of him still believed, in that final suspended moment, that conversation remained possible. It did not. He was driven to a warehouse facility connected to the construction project in Flatbush. The interior was already prepared, not elaborately, efficiently. The men who did this were not theatrical. They were professional. They had done this before, and would do it again, and approached the work with the detached competence of men who had long since separated action from meaning. Calandra was killed inside that warehouse. The body was wrapped, weighted, and transported to the foundation site before the concrete pour scheduled for the following morning. By dawn, he was beneath 6 feet of reinforced concrete. By afternoon, construction had resumed normally above him. His fabric stall sat locked for 4 days before anyone formally noticed his absence. His wife already knew. She had always known this was how it would end. She just never said it aloud. The investigation was brief, almost insultingly so. Brooklyn detectives filed a missing persons report, canvassed the garment district, spoke to vendors who remembered nothing, saw nothing, knew nothing. The particular amnesia of a neighborhood that understood survival. Vincent, the shoe repairman, was never questioned. No construction site was ever excavated. No arrest was ever made. Calandra's wife waited 3 years before accepting the legal designation of presumed dead. She sold the row house on East 21st Street and moved her children to New Jersey. She never spoke publicly about what happened, not because she lacked courage, because speaking required an audience willing to act on what they heard. In 1979 Brooklyn, that audience did not exist. The Gambino family continued operating without interruption. Castellano continued receiving guests at his Staten Island mansion. The concrete unions continued pouring foundations across the 5 boroughs. The political relationships that had insulated the operation continued functioning precisely as designed. What changed was smaller and more significant. On Calandra's block, every remaining vendor paid their weekly tribute the following Tuesday, without hesitation, without negotiation. Amounts that had previously required reminding were suddenly produced voluntarily, promptly, without eye contact. The system had demonstrated its integrity. That was the actual purpose of Robert Calandra's death. Not punishment, not vengeance. Demonstration. He was never meant to be a victim. He was meant to be a lesson. Permanent, embedded in the infrastructure of the city itself, invisible and omnipresent simultaneously. Concrete remembers what courts forget. We tell ourselves that organized crime exists outside society, that it is a parasite clinging to the edges of civilization, visible, containable, ultimately defeatable by sufficient institutional will. Robert Calandra's story refuses that comfort. He did not die in the shadows of society. He died inside its foundations, literally beneath the infrastructure his city depended upon, beneath streets that politicians walked, beneath buildings that inspectors certified, beneath a system that absorbed his disappearance without disruption, without guilt, without pause. That is not a failure of law enforcement. That is a revelation about power. Because the Gambino family did not succeed despite the system. They succeeded through it. They found every seam where authority grew comfortable, where oversight grew selective, where the distance between law and enforcement became wide enough for a man to disappear into entirely. $10. That was the stated cause. But the real cause was older and darker. The immovable certainty of men who had never been refused, encountering a man who had simply grown too tired to comply. And the real lesson is not about the Gambinos. It is about what we build and what we bury, and how rarely we ask what lies beneath. Somewhere in Brooklyn, the concrete still stands. Calandra is still inside it, and the city still walks above him every day, unknowing, unhaunted, moving forward with the particular confidence of people who have never had to ask what their foundations truly cost. Every city has two architectures. The one you can see, steel, glass, concrete, the visible grammar of civilization, and the one buried beneath it, decisions made in quiet rooms, enforced through silent mechanisms, sealed permanently below the surface of ordinary life. Robert Calandra did not die because he was dangerous. He died because he was principled inside a system that could not afford principles. This is the oldest truth organized crime reveals. Not that evil exists among men, but that systems can be constructed which make compliance more rational than conscience, which make silence more survivable than speech. The Gambino family did not defeat Robert Calandra through superior force alone. They defeated him through superior infrastructure, through decades of patient institutional construction, legal, political, physical, that left an ordinary man with no viable ground to stand on. He refused $10. They had already bought everything around him. That is not merely the story of one man's death in Brooklyn in 1979. That is the story of how power actually functions, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, methodical elimination of alternatives. Until resistance becomes not just dangerous, but structurally impossible. Somewhere beneath a Brooklyn foundation, the concrete holds its silence, as it was designed to do, as it always has,